everybody who's been able to join us for what I hope is going to be a really thought-provoking, interesting, and hopefully impactful briefing event for MPs and invited members on the subject of legislation to ban conversion therapy. I'm Jeremy Clark. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Memorandum of Understanding Coalition, which this event is being put on behalf of. And I'd just like to thank the Royal College of Psychiatrists to start with for hosting the webinar today, and also Elliot Colburn and Alicia Cairns for working with the MOU in putting on this, as well as a series of briefings for MPs over the past month or so. I will introduce Elliot and Alicia shortly, but just to say a couple of housekeeping remarks for people, and then a very brief context from me. So those people who are joining us can use the Q&A function throughout to ask questions, and we will monitor those and certainly come to those during the Q&A section, if not before, if we need to. And during the Q&A section, if you want to join in, as in ask a question live and speak, simply use the raise your hand function, and we will come to you and invite you into the discussion that way. And also just to mention that we are recording the webinar, and we will make the recording available to MPs who've sent apologies, as well as our stakeholder group, who not everybody who's been able to make it today. So, well, our profession, the focus today is on mental health and the mental health disciplines. And our profession has to also hold its hand up and acknowledge that we should apologise to the LGBT+ community generally for the way we have mistreated people previously, and do better. We know that outcomes for LGBT+ people around mental health are worse on average than the general population. And we must do better then in terms of our services. But in this regard, on the specific issue we're talking about today, we have, I think those of us working in the discipline, also been shocked at the findings of the 2018 survey that the government did, that conversion therapy is not just, as we had thought, certainly the most abusive aspects of it, a thing of the past in mental health, where during the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, people were subjected to horrific kinds of attempted cures, aversion therapy. And my own branch of the discipline, psychoanalysis, has to also make an abject apology, since the whole idea of cure came originally from psychoanalysis, with the concept of arrested development, and anybody who fell short of the heterosexual ideal needing somehow therefore to be cured. If you were lucky, you would just be fall prey to what was called neurasthenia or depression. If you were unlucky, then you would be categorized as being psychotic or paranoid and subject to treatment on that basis. On the definition at that time used, that came from psychoanalysis, some awful things flowed from that, including the whole idea around eugenics, the whole horrors of the Second World War in Germany, and not just in Germany. Probably not many people realize that in the USA, screening for military service in the Second World War excluded anybody who was homosexual, excluded anybody who was gender deviant. Around 2 million men excluded on that basis, who then lost their reputations, lost any future prospect of employment, had their lives completely destroyed. So we certainly knew and must take responsibility for these grievous errors from the past. But we were shocked that the long shadow of that kind of prejudice still is casting a blight over the lives of LGBT plus people today. We've gone from a journey of partial decriminalisation of our entitlement to exist as openly gay people and live our lives, to now what we need to get on with, which is actual criminalisation of those who continue to seek to harm us. And all credit to Elliot and Alicia for championing this issue and bringing it forward. So before I introduce those, I'd like to ask Jonathan to play us a short message from Stephen Fry, who needs no introduction. He is an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatry and a campaigner on mental health. Some of you will remember him from his latest appearance on It's a Sin in Channel 4 as the Conservative MP trying to curry favour with the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. I should probably not say any more than that at this point. But ask Jonathan if he will play us the video from Stephen.
Hello there. This is Stephen Fry. Just wishing you a very successful event that I'm sorry I can't be at live, discussing this wretched business of conversion therapy. Over the years, I've had the privilege of talking to members of the House of Commons and Lords over issues of equalising the age of consent for same-sex and different-sex encounters, and of course for the final push to legalise same-sex marriages, of which I'm a happy and proud and grateful beneficiary. And during that time, I've made some television programs about homophobia and about some of the darker corners of it around the world, which included a long day spent talking to a conversion therapist, which was one of the most profoundly upsetting and distressing days you can imagine. Well, that was because it seems like banging one's head against a door. What was really upsetting was talking to those young people who had been forced by their parents to go and visit this counsellor, this therapist. I'm sure I'm pushing against an open door here in just repeating the obvious truth of the fact that such conversion therapies don't work. They are even more impossible than hammering square pegs into round holes, or I suppose another similarity might be the horrible days in which teachers would beat children into right-handedness because left-handedness was considered somehow a failure. You know, to question the nature and feelings, desires, hopes, instincts and very identities of young people and to make them ashamed of how they feel is a terrible thing to do. It's a form of monstrous abuse, really, and when it's pushed to the extreme of using pseudoscience cloaked under a hideous religious kind of goopy salad of lies and half-truths and distortions, it's a beastly way to behave. In the end, I suppose the only really important psychological thing is to understand how parents can be so misguided, so cruel, as to allow their children to be put through this, and how people can be so wretched and wicked as to set themselves up as capable of changing nature in this way. After all, gay life, love, bonding happens in nature in hundreds of thousands of instances. But there's only one species on Earth where there's been found this terrible scourge, homophobia, hatred, resentment, fear, and aggression towards same-sex behaviours. That's a peculiar thing, and that's something to be understood, I suppose. But anyway, I've talked enough. Listen, you know what it's about. It's about saving children from appalling shame, stigma that can drive them to hate themselves, fear who they are, in ways that we should not be encouraging. So all power to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you to Stephen Fry for that. Elliot Colburn, I'd like to come to you, MP for Carshalton and Sutton, who led the debate, the petitions debate on this subject, which I watched and was one of Parliament's best moments in the way that it brought together MPs from across the parties on the debate that you led, and which you spoke very movingly at yourself. And I saw that you've come up against, Stephen Fry mentioned homophobia there, some appalling, unacceptable attacks yourself. But perhaps I can just ask you to say something about this issue from your perspective.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for inviting me along. And it was a privilege and an honour, really, to lead that debate on the petition to ban conversion therapy in the United Kingdom. And I focused very heavily throughout the course of that debate on the stories of just some of the survivors that I've had the honour and privilege of meeting over the past year and a half, along with Alicia and many other colleagues from across the House as well, to hear their stories and to make sure that their stories got onto the record at Hansard. And I think the important reason that we have to listen to the survivors and tell their stories is because for so many, conversion therapy is not a process that you will survive. For so many, we will not hear the stories of those who have gone through conversion therapy and felt there was no other way out of the hatred that had been inflicted onto them than for them to take their own lives. So we have to listen to those who did survive and could tell their stories on behalf of others, so that we can realise how important it is to ban these practices in the UK. And I think the second reason why it was so important to talk about the stories of survivors was to highlight the fact that this is still happening in the United Kingdom today. This isn't some kind of historical injustice which doesn't occur anymore. This is happening right here, right now in our country. And while some of the more aggressive, overt forms of conversion therapy like electric shock treatment or corrective rape may already be illegal and may not be being practiced by the health service anymore, that is not to say that there aren't some really clandestine, underhand practices being dressed up as conversion therapy that are still happening. And of course, it is still not a criminal offence to send someone overseas to receive some of those treatments, which the UK no longer allows. That is why we need to have a ban in the UK today. That is why we have having to come together as cross-party MPs to call on the government to get this ban in place, because those survivors have been so brave in coming forward and sharing their stories with us. It's a very difficult thing for them to talk about, but we have to make sure that their sacrifices were not in vain. And we have to make sure that those voices who will never be heard, because sadly they felt that there was no other way out, that we do them justice and we bring forward that ban. So it really has been my privilege and my honour to speak to those survivors throughout the course of this past year. And I really do hope that through our collective efforts across the parties, we can bring forward that change, and it can be one of the most proudest moments, I think, of this Parliament. So I'm going to hand over to Alicia to talk a little bit more, who I've had the privilege to work with on this, and I count her as a very great friend. But I'm sure you'll hear a lot from the rest of my colleagues on the call from every political party, and I'm so grateful to see so many of them here and for their help and support on this. But let's make this Parliament the Parliament that we end and ban conversion therapy in the UK. We can do it, and I think it will be a great achievement and a great moment in British politics, and I really hope to be part of it.
Thank you very much, Elliot, and thank you for reminding us who really matters in this discussion, and all the work that you have done. So, Alicia, let's hear about then the work that you've been doing with the MOU and other stakeholders and campaigning groups, and your sense of what progress we're making and what we can say to survivors about the prospects for being able to bring an end to this awful practice.
Thank you, Jeremy. I just want to start by a big thank you to the MOU, to Iggy, to yourself. It's been a real privilege to work with you all over the last year. And Elliot and Stephen couldn't have put it any better. And I will leave it very much to helping set the case of why it's so important. And I'll go more into the kind of pedantics of legislation and really some of the thorny issues that I've come up against so far as a legislator trying to bring this in. So as a backbencher, when I got elected, I have been campaigning to get this through. This is the legislative change that I wanted to secure on a national stage. And the reason for it is that it is wrong. And because, like Elliot said, often the survivors can't speak for themselves, or they have been silenced because of what they've gone through. And there are people on our green benches who've been through this, and they're unable to speak about it, or they're unwilling to, or it's too difficult for them. And that's why it's so important that those of us who can be a voice are. So in terms of the legislation, the reason we need to make it an offence, although it might seem obvious to many, is first of all, we need to stop those who provide the therapy, so-called therapy, because it is fraud, it's quackery, and ultimately it's abuse. Secondly, the message it sends that we need to stop treating sexual orientation or gender identity as a pathology and help tackle the discrimination that still continues too much in our society. We need to stop those who coerce others into receiving this so-called treatment. We need to ban the advertising of it. We need to stop people being taken abroad for it, and we need to give victims the legal recourse they deserve. Now, like female genital mutilation, I believe, and I think everyone on this call believe, that we need a specific legislation rather than relying on, for example, GBH laws, not just because it sends a clear message, but because we need to tackle the non-physical aspects of so-called conversion therapy. So we need to be able to tackle those, but also the police and courts currently, they don't have sufficient clarity to allow them to secure prosecutions, to assist victims, to track persistent offenders, because this is persistent offenders who are doing this. But also, for example, the Victims Fund at the Ministry of Justice isn't set up to be able to fund specific support for survivors or for those who are possibly at risk of it. So back in March, I pulled together, March, I should put last year, I pulled together what I wanted legislation to look like. So first of all, criminalisation of a person who forces someone to undergo conversion therapy. I think that could sit under the Anti-Social Behaviour Crime and Policing Act. And it's about prosecuting parents or legal guardians or individuals who make children go through this through deception, coercion or threats. I should probably say at the start, I'm not a member of the government. So when I say I've pulled together my legislation just because I would like it, doesn't mean it's necessarily how it will be. The second part of the legislation is about tackling those who aid, abet and procure it, whether it's medical, therapeutic, holistic or psychotherapy treatments that are explicitly to change, repress or eliminate a person's sexual orientation or their desired gender identity. And I'll come back to that later because it's really important that this is about tackling those one-way street discussions, not valid, proper discussions that an individual might have, but one-way coercive discussions. And this also has to include those who provide premises for the hosting of conversion therapy. I also want to put in place legislation to deal with those who fail to protect a child under 16, advertising and promotion of conversion therapy. And then I would like to introduce something called conversion therapy protection orders. These should be through the family court, so essentially protecting children at risk of it. There should be a legal mandatory duty to report children who are at risk of it or have been through it. There needs to be a duty for survivors put into the Code of Practice of Victims of Crime. And we should be able to make sure that unfair trading regulations stop fraudulent advertising. Finally, I also want to see a conversion therapy phone line run by an LGBTQ+ charity. That is about not just providing counselling and support, but also whistleblowing, because as I said, this is repeat offenders and we need to identify them and crack down on them. And finally, obviously, when you bring in a new bill, it's a great opportunity to do a public communications campaign to make clear that this is unacceptable. So that was back in March. And then since that time, I've been working with stakeholders and partners, the MOU, 15 LGBTQ+ stakeholder groups, senior representatives of all major faiths, lawyers, academics, and 40 fellow Conservative MPs to create a definition of what conversion therapy is, because it seems quite straightforward when you think about it, but actually as legislators, we're looking at the very specifics of exactly what legislation is and what it therefore is as a practice. And I'm very happy to share that definition with anyone. And I'm very grateful to the MOU for assisting me in doing that. And again, crucially, that definition includes both sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, in September, that definition, apologies, that's my 3-month-old coughing away. In September, I put forward this definition to the government, and it is one of the definitions that has been considered by government lawyers who over the last few months have been looking at the different types of definitions of conversion therapy. But what I really want to focus on today is the issues that people raise when it comes to this legislation, the worries people have. So the first one that is often raised is the concept of consent. So I think when it comes to children, it's not particularly complicated. Pretty much everyone agrees that children can't consent, so therefore legislation for under 18s is reasonably straightforward. But for over 18s, it does get more complex. So my argument is that we should not prosecute anyone who may or may not have consented to conversion therapy. It shouldn't be unlawful to purchase or seek it out, but it should be illegal to provide it or to advertise it or to coerce someone into it. But I do think, whilst that's my pragmatic response, Parliament and our courts have long said that you can't consent to bodily harm and you can't consent to torture. And so I would argue that should extend to mental health and mental harms as well. And we should treat that equally. And conversion therapy not only comes under the bodily harm, but it also comes under mental harm. And I think it's really important that actually, as we look at health issues across the piece, that we update our concept of consent to include mental harms. Essentially, the fact is that conversion therapy gives you mental and physical scars for life. And for that reason, I argue consent cannot be freely given. But as I've said, there's a pragmatic way of dealing with that as legislators. The second argument I come up against is that banning it won't really end the practice, or it's not really happening in our country. And Elliot and Stephen have already spoken about that. And obviously it's a sin, and various other things have shown that this has happened. And the many brave survivors who've spoken to me make clear it is. You can never truly eradicate a heinous practice like this, same as female genital mutilation or forced marriage. But if we don't ban it, there is no legal recourse for survivors to prosecute those responsible for hurting them, including persistent offenders. Also, without prosecution, there's no deterrent. And we have to also make sure, as I said, that sexual orientation is not seen as a pathology. On the point on numbers, the government did the biggest survey of LGBTQ+ people in the world. And 2% of people said they'd received conversion therapy. Now, some people would say, well, that's only 2%. In this case, that's 2,600 people. But those are just those people who were brave enough to report it, those who recognise what they've been through. And also, in my view, it doesn't matter if it's happening to 10 people in our country. It is wrong and it is illegal, and it's our duty as politicians to make sure it is outlawed. The next common topic that comes up is this concept of transgender counselling versus conversion therapy, because people who associate or identify as a different gender and wish to change it, technically are going through a transition or a conversion, you might say. So how do you make sure that legislation doesn't stop that? Well, first of all, what the research shows is that currently, now in our day and age, the people most likely to go through conversion therapy are trans individuals. So any ban has to protect trans individuals, or else it leaves those most vulnerable still at risk. Now, existing support for trans people is regulated through the NHS. And essentially, that's essentially the way we should go with this. I think there needs to be a specific exemption within the legislation for professionally accredited or CQC registered individuals, a kind of, approved register of therapists and practitioners who can support those undergoing gender transition, or who want to have those critical conversations with a GP or a mental health professional about what they are feeling and what they're going through. If we have that safeguard, it means that all those who need support can still get it, and that professional accredited individuals who do no harm at the heart of what they do and want a two-way conversation can still do their work without any risk of being criminalised. The next topic is faith concerns, and I know that Sir Norman Lamb's going to talk about this later, so I won't go into it too much, but religious liberty is of course fundamental, but so is the liberty to live your life free of identity-based violence and abuse, and that is what conversion therapy is. So we have to protect conversations between religious leaders and a member of their flock, and this isn't about a fight between faith and unbelief, but we also have to protect people from practices that no qualified mental health professional would be allowed to undertake. And the reason why conversion therapy has been rejected is because the opposite of an open-ended exploration with difficult conversations. It's a therapy where there's one objective and one endpoint, which is stopping someone from being gay or stopping someone from being trans or asexual or bisexual. So conversion therapy isn't about keeping choices, but eliminating them completely. So there should be no argument that in some ways we're going to stop legitimate discussion. And that's why representatives of every major faith group have backed a ban. I know Dr. Rowan Williams will of course talk about this more later, but also why the Church of England has not requested an opt-out from the legislation. And I think that's a really important point. The church does not feel threatened by this legislation. We have seen evangelical preachers, Baptist preachers, you name it. We've seen members of the Islamic faith, Hindu faith, Jewish faith, all come together saying we need to tackle this because it's about dealing with improper practices and giving people recourse to justice if that position of trust has been abused. The next, and I think actually the final complication I come across often is people saying that this is too complicated to ban. It's going to be too much of an overstretch. And I think as legislators, this is a difficult one often to explain to the public because people say we should just ban it. But we do have to make sure there aren't unintended consequences. And we do have to make sure this is the right ban the right way, not least for mental health professionals and others who've helped arrange this call. So one of the reasons why the ban is so technically difficult is the huge range of types of issues it deals with, from forced marriage, and I've met victims of forced marriage as a form of conversion therapy, to corrective rape, to fraudulent forms of talking therapy. But there are also some that are more straightforward. So for example, when the Prime Minister was Mayor of London, he banned advertising of conversion therapy on the tube. So we know that's a relatively more straightforward part of this. There is a genuine view amongst some legislators, politicians, our colleagues, that this either will go too far or be pointless because it's either already illegal if it's really, really bad, or we're trying to over-regulate and go into parts of society where we have no place. My view is that in cases that would be banned, there is a clear intent to specifically suppress orientation or gender identity. So there is a concerted effort to make the person not LGBT. So we can do this and we can get it right, but it is complicated legislation and it has taken time to bring it forward because we do have to make sure it's right. I hope that gives a kind of helpful overview of some of the issues that I hope will kickstart the conversation when we get to the Q&A. But like I said, I've been campaigning for this since the day I got elected, and I'm really pleased we do have the support of the Health Secretary, the Equality Secretary, and the Prime Minister, who back in June said that there will be a ban and the legislative ban is coming forward. This wouldn't have happened without the campaigning work of people for decades on this, and I'm so grateful to them. And I really hope that we'll see continued cross-party consensus on this call and beyond, and rise above party politics, just like we did in the Westminster Hall debate, which was a really moving event to be part of. Because there are people across this country that need this ban. There are colleagues on our benches for whom it didn't come soon enough. And I think I've said this many times before, and I will say it again, love isn't a pathology and it doesn't need treating. And a ban is coming and it will change and save lives, but it does have to be the right ban. And we have to make sure it protects all those in need, that also practitioners don't feel that they're at risk of criminalisation for doing their job, which they should absolutely be able to continue to do. And I hope that was a helpful scene setter of the kind of legislative challenges.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for a really compelling argument and a comprehensive, as you say, overview, but also point-by-point explanation of the different issues for us. And I could hear that your little baby daughter agreed with every word of what you were saying, as did I. So thank you very much for that. I want to come now to Dr. Trudy Seneviratne and Fiona Ballantyne-Dykes. Trudy is the registrar at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and Fiona is the Chief Professional Standards Officer at the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, where she is also the Deputy Chief Executive. And we'll come back to some of those issues that Alicia was saying to do with how do we implement this kind of legislation across mental health professionals, and in terms of the regulation of the different mental health professionals, how you would see that working. We'll come back to that. But Alicia has also set out a very clear kind of definition, and a definition of the problem and the issue. And I wanted to ask both of you to comment on what you think the level of kind of understanding and awareness is amongst our profession, our discipline, of these issues, where we're up to as a discipline in being able to get on top of this ourselves at this point. Trudy, could you start off?
Of course, Jeremy, thank you. And just to say, I'm really pleased on behalf of the college to be supporting this ban. The College of Psychiatrists has actually long opposed these so-called conversion therapies, and we included this, for example, in our position statement back in 2018. And I think clinical and research have very much shown us the impact on people's mental health with conversion therapies, and how, you know, how the devastating impact on people. I guess as doctors and psychiatrists, one of our fundamental principles is to do no harm. Looking through, I'm very grateful to you, Jeremy, and also to Iggy Moon and to Alicia Keynes for taking this forward. Thinking through, I guess, you know, the difference between genuine therapies and therapies that might be included, I think there are several aspects to consider. One is to be very clear that we, between us collectively, have an agreed definition of what conversion treatments or therapies are, so that there aren't any unwanted consequences from any change in law. So we don't want to do any further harm to people. We really want to get this right moving forward. The other issue is that it's very important that that we collectively must avoid any form of legal ban that would make it difficult for people from all backgrounds, young people, you know, adults, to come from all backgrounds, regardless of their societal and other cultural, faith backgrounds, so that they're able to access help at the right time, to be able to come to terms with their sexual identity or gender identity. So that's really important. And again, in terms of differentiating genuine therapy from the conversion therapy, I mean, the college absolutely supports psychiatrists in fully exploring an individual or person's sexual orientation or gender identity, and that needs to include partners, families, other family members where that's appropriate, and for those treatments and therapies to be delivered in a non-judgmental and a supportive and an ethical manner. So it's very important that any legislative ban, by its nature, must protect services, and I'm talking about services perhaps that psychiatrists are delivering, but anything that, you know, other professionals and GPs and other healthcare professionals or counsellors might be delivering, and that people are protected, and that the law must, I'm just repeating that, you know, the law must support people in being able to access these services where needed. And I think what Alicia said is really, really quite important, and the wording is really important. Of course, this needs to be worked through, but the safeguard of distinguishing what is a conversion therapy from what is a safe, supportive therapy delivered by the appropriately qualified professional, I think that's very, very important. And thinking about the regulation of this now, psychiatrists and, you know, are very much regulated in their profession as they are trained, but additional safeguards to all professionals who are involved in this, I think, is very important. And really, by finishing and saying that collectively, as a collective body and as a society, that we just, you know, I will go back to what I said at the start, which is to do no harm to people, and that people must be allowed to explore their sexuality, their sexual identity, their gender identity, and or gender expression in a safe place.
Thank you very much, Trudy. Fiona, I want to just come straight away to a question that's come up repeatedly in these discussions. Trudy's already touched on it, as has Alicia, which is to do with how we regulate professionals in this space, so that we get both the balance right in terms of the people that we need to protect, as well as not having unintended consequences for professionals doing their proper job. Can you say something to help explain to people about the position of counselling and psychotherapy and how you would see us being able to implement this effectively in relation to counsellors and psychotherapists?
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for everyone here. BACP has over 57,000 members, counsellors and psychotherapists. And, you know, we were part of the original signatories of the original MOU. And to that extent, all our members are signed up to the principles of that as part of their signing on up to the ethical framework. We were also one of the first, in fact, voluntary accredited register with the Professional Standards Authority. And this is speaking to the issue that you're asking about, which is what do we mean by professionally accredited individuals? Because where you're in a statutory regulated area of the profession, then that's very straightforward. But in our area, it's about registers choosing to apply to the Professional Standards Authority to have their register accredited, which offers certain safeguards around the standards they apply from entry to membership, around training, and also particularly around redress. So professional conduct, sanctions, removing people from the register, sharing that information with other professional accredited registers, and publishing that information on our websites. However, what that doesn't address is the fact that you don't have to be registered to call yourself a counsellor or psychotherapist. And there are many people, we don't know how many actually, who do operate in that unregulated sphere. And that raises some very important questions around protection of the public on all matters actually, but particularly on this issue. As a therapist myself, the very term conversion therapy or reparative therapy is quite offensive because there's nothing therapeutic about working or supporting an individual to reject the very essence of who they are. And we know from the moving testimonies of survivors and the other research that this is not only damaging, but also a real contravention of their human rights. So the question then arises, well, why aren't you statutory regulated? Well, there was an attempt at that around 2012, since when the accredited register scheme came in. We know that the Professional Standards Authority have just finished a consultation on the future of accredited registers, and we are waiting for greater clarification around what that might look like. And it's dependent on various other pieces of work that government are doing as well around regulation. But there were some signals in that consultation around enhanced regulation, potentially the mention of licensing. And I can just say from the point of view of BACP and many of our colleagues who we work closely with who hold registers, we are very intent on holding this direction of travel to account, finding out what the plans are, what is possible, in recognition that the current situation is not protecting the public to the extent that it should. So I don't know if that's enough at the moment, but we have pretty clear indication from the Government Equalities Office that there's no plans for statutory regulation for our profession, even though there's a small section of it that is already statutory regulated.
Thank you, Fiona. That's really helpful. I suppose just very briefly to summarise in a sense what Alicia and Trudy and yourself have all said is that there are some important technical issues, which is probably why the Prime Minister said there are some technical difficulties that we need to get right in terms of the definition, exemptions for properly regulated professionals within that, and how in practical terms we're going to be able to make sure that we cover the range of activities and professionals that we need to be able to cover under those exemptions. So like yourselves, Dr. Iggy Moon and myself met with the officials in the Government Equalities Office, and we have pledged on behalf of the MOU, and we'll obviously be drawing on your, Trudy, and your support to bring that expertise to help the officials get this right, because these technical issues are going to be really important as to whether or not we achieve the benefit of protecting people in the way we want to. So thank you for that. We now need to turn to an issue, though, which is not just about the technicalities, but about some kind of fundamental issues of principle and issues of belief and conflicts of rights that no doubt will be raised if and when we get to discuss legislation in Parliament from MPs with different strong views about these issues, but that will also need to be resolved for the law to become effective and to become adhered to. So we are really pleased and privileged to be able to have Lord Rowan Williams with us today, as well as Sir Norman Lamb. And Lord Williams, I'd like to come to you first, if I may. You obviously have huge experience as the Archbishop in all kinds of manner of conflicts between different faith groups, and I imagine also between the LGBT community wanting to express their rights. How do you see us being able to resolve this kind of conflict?
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel this afternoon. Just a couple of brief observations on the general points. It seems to me that when we look for a change in the law, we always have to begin by asking, what problem exactly is this meant to solve? What protections are actually lacking at the moment? And I've heard already in the discussion some of the difficulties about definition there, but I think that is one of the big challenges we have. What protections are substantively lacking? And when I look at the different ways in which the conversion therapy question plays out, it seems to me there's a relatively straightforward area and a not so straightforward area. The relatively straightforward area, in spite of all that's just been said about registered and unregistered practitioners, the relatively straightforward area is looking at what might be regarded as abusive or fraudulent practice, claiming to be therapeutic. And most of us, I think, would have a reasonably clear sense of what that is and isn't. As has just been said, therapy which, so to speak, has designs on you, which quite clearly has a predetermined outcome, is something which is professionally rightly suspect and illegitimate. That's not too difficult to define, even if it may be a little bit difficult to police in terms of registration and so on, but I think we know what we mean there. The slightly more difficult area has to do with what you might call the internal operation of religious communities. And do we include under this the informal counseling, prayer, etc., or even just pulpit teaching that goes on in different religious communities? And this is where we're really, I think, on a bit of a knife edge. When the law purports, if it ever purports, to determine what can concretely be taught or even prayed about in a religious community, there is an obvious problem about the law claiming something beyond its scope. But this is where it's crucial to define what are the protections that are lacking. And that's why I'd want to frame this second area very much in the context of an overall understanding of how we think of religious abuse and how we think of how religious abuse, that is abuse within religious communities, is addressed, controlled, and how redress is gained. And those internal issues seem to me absolutely necessary to grasp, but not easy to resolve in one fell swoop. So I want just to suggest that one way of thinking this through might be to begin with something that emerged recently from the independent inquiry into child sex abuse in relation to the Church of England, where the question was raised, is the Church of England, or indeed any other religious body, properly capable of monitoring its own practice without independent assessment. In other words, you need some external input into the workings of a religious community in order to create, to settle what are acceptable limits of behavior, to rule out the abuse, the manipulation, and whatever else that there may be. And this is very much to do with the issue of redress that's been raised. I think it's also to do with the issue of information. That is to say, we might be able, we should, I think, be able to say to religious professionals, it is not within your scope to deny information or access to certain kinds of support and help, certain kinds of non-overdetermined therapy. So just as we might say with an issue like abortion in the Roman Catholic Church, we could not and should not prescribe the ethical perspective that a community teaches. Equally, we should not legitimize the restriction of access to information and so on. Now, I wonder whether there's any model of agreement about some such protocols in the training of religious professionals, in codes of conduct which religious professionals sign up to, which would allow us to say, we're not seeking to prescribe the content of teaching. We are seeking to guarantee for members of those communities access, redress, and protection of a kind which simply as citizens they are entitled to. So I don't have a magic bullet here by any means, but I think those two wings of the argument we can take forward a little bit. Therapeutic practice in the general sense, this is not a matter of religious liberty. This is a matter of, as I say, abusive or fraudulent practice, which we can define as such. The religious liberty question comes in terms of what can be taught, discussed in certain terms within a community. And while we can't and shouldn't seek to control that, we can seek, I think, to guarantee certain freedoms within that by seeking for agreements with the religious professionals, which would secure a baseline of what I've got access and redress. So that's just a thought on that subject.
Thank you very much, Rowan. I think that is incredibly helpful. And I think there is room for dialogue here between mental health professionals and faith leaders about this subject of safeguarding and training, and how we put in place those kinds of protocols. I gave evidence myself actually in front of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and I think that's an incredibly helpful way of framing the problem and the solution. So thank you very much for that. Norman, I worked with you in your days as the mental health minister, and you were the person who brought forward attention to this issue in setting up, helping to set up the Memorandum of Understanding group. Could you tell us a little bit about that background? And from your perspective, the progress that we've made and the progress we still need to make in terms of bringing an end to these kinds of practices.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. And it's been a good discussion, and it's great, I have to say, to hear from both Elliot and Alicia their advocacy of this cause in Parliament, because it's going to be necessary to have effective advocates across Parliament in order to win this argument. But I think over the last decade or so, we've made real progress actually in understanding and respecting better the rights of people with mental ill health, for example, and also respecting the rights of everyone, of all of us, to be who we are. I thought Fiona put it beautifully when she said that this practice challenges the very essence of who we are. And it was funny, I'd written that phrase down and Fiona used it, and she captured it, I think, brilliantly, because this is, in my view, a human rights issue. It's to respect and to protect every individual's right to live their lives as they see fit, without any abuse or interference with that. And I think the truth is that we've made real progress. I think the Memorandum of Understanding was a very significant first step, bringing together key LGBT+ organisations, religious groups, and professional bodies into a completely agreed statement, which I think has advanced the cause. But of course, as the survey that Alicia mentioned in her presentation showed, the practice continues. And so if we know that there are still people in our country who are at risk from this, then we must act. And Fiona was also right, I think, in highlighting the sense that the expression gay conversion therapy completely fails to convey the seriousness of what this is. And that, of course, is a problem, because it means that the public and many politicians don't fully understand how, in a sense, people play with fire when they engage in these unacceptable practices. And as Elliot and I think Alicia both said, you know, we are talking here about people potentially losing their lives, taking their own lives as a result of this completely unacceptable practice. And when you're thinking about the impact on young people, vulnerable young people, this is a very serious abuse. And so the need for us to convince parliamentarians and government of the seriousness of this, I think is very real. So, you know, that's why I think that we now need to move beyond the Memorandum of Understanding. I think there will still be a role for a revised Memorandum of Understanding under a new legal framework, because we hope that the legal framework acts in itself as a preventive measure to stop anyone engaging in this practice, but also to provide redress and criminal culpability for those people who still decide to proceed with it. But beyond that, I think we need that framework provided by the Memorandum of Understanding to sort of fill in the detail, as it were. So the combination of a new law, a revised Memorandum of Understanding, and clear professional regulation which understands the boundaries is what we need to aspire to. And we should be in no doubt about the importance of this issue and winning this battle in Parliament. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Norman. And thank you for the pioneering work that you've done that we can now build on with the work that Alicia is leading. I mean, you've mentioned there something which I think is important, which is that we need to have legislation that works as the professional bodies in mental health do across all the 4 nations that make up the United Kingdom, because these protections need to be able to apply to all our populations.
Yeah.
And you've also mentioned the importance of cross-party support to get the right legislation in place and a consistent approach. So I'm very pleased that we've got spokespersons for the other parties to be able to join us. So I'd like to come to each of you in turn, please, Charlotte, Hannah and Vera, to say something about the position of your own party from your role as shadow equality spokespersons and spokesperson on this issue for the SNP, so that we can get a sense of whether there is a common understanding and a common view about how we move forward with this. Charlotte, can I come to you, please?
Thanks ever so much, Jeremy. My name's Charlotte Nichols. I'm the Member of Parliament for Warrington North and Labour's Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. The Labour Party position on so-called LGBT conversion therapies are that they're disgusting, exploitative, damaging, and a relic of bigotry. In 2021, we recognise better than ever what illness and disease looks like, and being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans is not a sickness. It's a fundamental part of a person's very identity. So so-called LGBT conversion therapies need to be banned. Peddlers of these supposed treatments not only perpetuate a fraud on the public, but cause genuine harm, psychological distress, and lasting emotional damage. The 2018 National Faith and Sexuality Survey found that 58.8% of people who had undergone such therapies had suffered mental health issues. Significant numbers cited anxiety, self-harm, and eating disorders. More than 2/3 had suicidal thoughts, and more than 1/3 had actually attempted suicide. And that's why all major UK therapy professional bodies and the NHS oppose treatments that try to change a person's sexual orientation or suppress a person's gender identity. But government research shows that over 50% of conversion therapy practices happen within a faith setting, which means that for any ban to be an effective ban, it cannot have a religious carve-out or exemption. All of our major faith groups support a ban, as was reiterated at the Interfaith Conference held remotely in London in December 2020. As a religious Jew and a bi woman, I've been heartened by contributions in the debate and work being done by faith leaders across the faith spectrum who hold their faith close to their heart and are respected within their communities. But no, there should be no dichotomy to reconcile between religious freedom and protecting the safety, well-being and dignity of the LGBT community. I personally believe fundamentally that all people were created B'Tselem Elohim, and certainly within our texts, there's plenty of room for queer theological readings and rabbinic rulings through the ages that take a far wider view of sex and gender than the modern binary. I think when looking at how we get the language in the law right in determining what is appropriate pastoral support around the exploration of your gender or sexuality in a faith setting and what is harmful conversion practices, it's really about the directionality of it. If there's one outcome that would be acceptable, if there's coercion, or if there is an abuse of power by faith leaders, then this is abusive. Rabbi Laura Jana Klausner referred to this as hate prayer and prayer-based abuse. But I think perhaps we need to take the word prayer out of it altogether if we're talking about these practices, as it risks legitimizing them. Putting laws on the statute book, such as protection orders for people who are vulnerable to cultural religious pressure to suppress, deny, or forcibly change their sexuality or gender identity, is not a matter of virtue signaling. It would make concrete legal defences for people who need them and would make it simpler for statutory support services to work together to help people in need. The Labour Party welcomes the action that the government has taken in the past decade to legislate against female genital mutilation and to take further steps against honour-based violence and forced marriage, where these protection order frameworks are already in place and where we've been able to reconcile religious freedom and banning harm done in the name of religion. This is an opportunity to show the world the face of global Britain, setting an example and doing the right thing. And I think the time has come for the government to ban these practices. If they do, the opposition will support them. And in my role as Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities, I'm really keen to continue dialogue with stakeholders about how we can ensure that the legislation that we're seeking works. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you also for those personal remarks. we've started a dialogue ourselves with Keshet as one of the Jewish organisations, and we very much want to continue this dialogue between mental health practitioners and different faith organisations. So I'm sure we'll be looking to you to help us further that as well. Hannah, you also spoke very movingly in the petitions debate, but you're here representing as a spokesperson for the SNP. So perhaps you could say something about the position of your party, as well as whatever remarks you want to make in a personal capacity.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you for the work that you have done along with Alicia, Elliot, and faith-based communities and the medical profession, because I think it's really, for me, the recent months, and certainly since the time I came out, which was just when I got elected, and since I've been in Parliament, I have learned so much about some of the issues in the LGBT community and continue to learn. And I don't think any of us have all of the wisdom, and I think that's important to say, and it requires real determined cross-party work, which is heartening to see. And I think that debate really exemplified that. But from a specifically SNP perspective, I'm now a backbencher. I'm in the fortunate position that I get to speak on lots of different issues. And as an out lesbian and a proud member of the LGBTQ+ community, I feel the weight of responsibility as a legislator very keenly. So I'm in opposition at Westminster, but my party's in government in Scotland. So in terms of the official lines and what we have said very clearly in our manifesto, and it's important to understand that some of this is reserved to Westminster and some of it is devolved to Scotland. And actually, I'm sure Alicia has found this on her journey through the legislative process, that sometimes those things are not clear cut. And actually, we really need to work very closely together to make sure that any legislation that's brought forward is robust as quickly as possible, but also that we do work with the devolved administrations. And I know that there's a determination to do that, but we believe that there's no place for conversion therapy in Scotland, and that such practices has been said many times, discriminatory, harmful and demeaning to the mental health and well-being of LGBTQ+ people. We welcome the commitment that's been made by the UK government and the work that's been done in terms of the LGBT action plan, and we fully support it. But what we have said is that in our recent manifesto for the election, if that legislation is not brought forward at Westminster, we will do what we can within the limits of our powers in Scotland. Obviously, justice, health and education are all devolved to Scotland. So there are questions for me about what more can be done in Scotland. We are already working in terms of education. Some of you may be familiar with the TIE campaign, Time for Inclusive Education, the funding that they have recently received by the Scottish Government, and the rollout of inclusive education. That plays a huge role, I think, in some of these issues and some of these practices. I think what I've seen certainly in Scotland and across the UK from the faith community is heartening, but I think we have to be clear that there cannot be caveats and carve-outs, and that religious organisations can hide behind religious freedom to continue any kind of harmful practices. So I think that's something that we all feel very strongly about. I think what I would also say, to be very open and upfront, there's a End Conversion Therapy in Scotland campaign, and they're doing a really incredible job, and I've been doing some work with them. I have not seen as many SNP candidates as I would like to be signing up to that, and in the final week or so of the campaign, I'm going to be doing all I can within my own party. I think it would be fair to say we all face challenges within our own parties, but I know the leadership of my party is absolutely committed and to ending conversion therapy. In a recent speech, she said that she reaffirmed a commitment to equal rights and reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And if the UK government does not take serious action on conversion therapy, an SNP government will bring forward our own legislation to end these discriminatory and harmful practices against LGBT people, insofar as the powers of the Scottish Parliament allow. And that is, I think that's important, but I do feel confident that Alicia and Elliot are going to press their own government to bring forward this legislation. And I fully recognise the work that has been done by them and how complex this is. But complexity is not a reason not to legislate. I also recognise that legislating does not ban a particular practice, and that's really important as well. When Section 28 was scrapped, or 2A as it was in Scotland, that did not overnight mean that educational institutions were a safe place for LGBT people. Far from it. And I think that that's something, I lived with that legacy. I know the impact that not coming out till later in life has had on myself, psychologically and emotionally. So I cannot even begin to imagine what it is like for young LGBT people and older folk as well who have been subject to conversion therapy, and particularly those in the trans community who right now are suffering hugely because of a public discourse that is hostile and a public media that is in many respects hostile towards them. So I think we have to recognise that this is multifaceted, it is complex, and it is going to take all of us on a cross-party basis across many disciplines to keep it in the public consciousness, to keep it on the political and public agenda, and to continue pressing. And I give my personal commitment, and I know the vast majority of those in my political party and movement want to see conversion therapy banned. Sometimes it's the hardest thing is taking on your own colleagues and friends to challenge their views. But that's something that I know my party and those who are here with us today are doing within their own political parties and movements. And we have to continue to do that, work cross-party and see this horrific practice ended.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to ask a question that's just been asked because it's directly to you. Why can't you, Matt Heinemann asks, why can't you just go ahead and pass legislation because within the scope of your powers, and set a marker then for the rest of the UK to follow?
I think that's a really good question, and one that I'll be really honest, when I was preparing for this event, I was grappling with it myself, and I was thinking, why can't we just do this? Now, I'm not in government in Scotland, but it's a question that I'm very happy to take. So I would say very directly, I can't give you a straight answer on that. So I'm not going to pretend to flannel and fluff around it. What I know that we can do in terms of health and education are ban practices, ban promotion. But in terms of the criminal justice stuff, I'm not entirely clear. And I was not able to get a clear indication from briefings from the Scottish Parliament and discussions, but I think it's a very fair challenge and a fair point. And my personal view would be we should be doing it. We should be setting down a marker. I think Alicia has set out some of the complexities around the legislation, but that should not be a deterrent. I think we should just get on and do it. And, there's obviously been a sort of keenness to see do it alongside the UK, I think, but I personally think that we should just be getting on and doing it. And there's now significant pressure on the politicians who are about to be elected to the Scottish Parliament to do that. There was, I'd be very happy to share a speech that my colleague, the Minister for Equalities, had made in the Scottish Parliament, and where she herself identified some of the complexities. She actually said, we fully support the moves by the UK government to end conversion therapy and are engaging with them as they develop proposals. The legislative timetable for the current parliamentary session is currently fully committed, and we're continuing to engage with officials in the UK government. And we will consider bringing forward legislation on what the devolved and reserved responsibilities are. I think the issue is this has not been brought to the fore soon enough. And we have not, as a government, necessarily focused on it specifically. I think that's possibly a criticism we could levy at, other governments as well. But I think we should be in the business of getting things done rather than necessarily slinging mud. But I fully take on board the point that is made that we should just get on and do what we can within the powers that we have. I hope that answers the question as directly as possible.
No, that was a very direct answer. I shall summarise it by saying that you feel we need to get our ducks in a row, and Matt Heinemann and ourselves on the MOU will certainly be willing to help you in Scotland get the ducks in a row as well as in the other administrations as well. So we should work together on this.
I'd be really keen on that, and particularly with Alicia as well, just so, because I'm sure she's travelled a journey that we need to travel, you know, in Scotland and in the other devolved administrations.
Absolutely, making this all aligned is a key opportunity, I think. Vera, I'm coming to you, and the Lib Dems have a great tradition on LGBT issues, going back to Roy Jenkins as Home Secretary, who liberalised Sexual Offences Act and decriminalised homosexuality in the first instance. Could you tell us where your party stands on conversion therapy?
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you again for putting this event together. It is so important that we talk about it, the difficulties, but also where we actually agree. Norman has already spoke very powerfully earlier, and indeed, under his leadership, he's been pioneering that we are getting this terrible, terrible practice banned. It is a shame, really, on us as a developed democracy in the UK that this is still around. And I am committed to take up the baton from where Norman and the Liberal Democrats have left them before I joined Parliament in 2017. And I'm now the spokesperson for equalities. And I'm going to read out a short thing that I've put together, which is the Lib Dem position. But I want to, at the end of it, also quickly talk about an event that I was only being co-chairing, I think last week or maybe a couple of weeks ago, with religious leaders, and what my sense is what has come out of that. But let me just first read this. So we Liberal Democrats believe that so-called conversion therapy is a practice which reinforces the narrative that individuals in the LGBT+ community are somewhat broken and need to be fixed. It is nothing short of medieval, but there are people right now in the UK who are experiencing this and who are being made to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with who they are. This can cause deep trauma with long-lasting mental health implications, and indeed, tragically, people also lose their lives and take their lives. The Liberal Democrats have fought long and hard, as you've already said, Jeremy, to ban conversion therapy, and we will continue to fight until there is an effective ban. At our 2015 spring conference, we voted overwhelmingly to oppose conversion therapy for all LGBT+ people, and we have continued to raise the issue in parliamentary questions and debates. It has now been over 1,000 days since the government first pledged to end this abhorrent practice. And it is really very disappointing that the government is currently dithering and delaying banning conversion therapy. We cannot ignore that the harm is there, it's real, and it has already been said today, it is dangerous if these practices continue. Without a meaningful ban, conversion therapy will continue to ruin lives. Warm words and pledges are now not enough. The government must bring forward comprehensive proposals to ban LGBT conversion therapy in all private and public spheres, including a ban on advertising. This ban must explicitly cover conversion therapies targeting trans, intersex, and asexual people. We need to protect all LGBT+ people from this practice, no matter their age, religion, or their cultural background, or whether they were coerced or have supposedly consented. And it is vital that victims and survivors are at the center of the government's approach through specialist support, and particularly in their religious and cultural settings. We Liberal Democrats believe in true equality. We believe that government should take an active role, both in punishing discrimination and in ensuring that it does not happen in the first place. There is no doubt that the past few years have seen great strides in LGBT+ rights in the UK and across the world, but there is far more that needs to be done to create a world in which every LGBT+ person can live safely, equally, and freely. The UK must ban conversion therapies and send an unequivocal message that whoever you love, whoever you are, you do not need to be fixed. So that is what we believe. And I call myself a Christian, and Dr. Rowan Williams, maybe, you know, I'm a sort of pick and mix Christian, but I do believe that at the center of this is what Christians believe, is if the full acceptance of who we are. And when we discussed this with other religious leaders a couple of weeks ago, as I already said, I think at the real heart of where we can say the conversation needs to go is a full acceptance of that. When people pray, they don't pray that you become somebody different. In my belief as a Christian, God accepts us who we are, and therefore, you know, no religious settings or groupings should pray for something that is different from who you are. And if that is the starting point from anything, where also legislation goes, then I can't quite see where there should ultimately a big conflict. I know that currently we're having these discussions, but if we are starting from that, we are who we are, and we all have to accept that, and that we also accept the journey that people, young people particularly, have to go through in order to identify who they are, and they should do that in freedom and unhindered, then legislation, in my view, can be built around it. And Alicia, thank you very much for all the work that you've already done to go really into the details of the legislation. But for me, that should be at the core of the legislation, and that is at the core of any legislation that is about human rights. And this is a human rights issue. And therefore, the banning of conversion therapy and the legislation around it, not just to ban it, but also how do we protect those on the journey, is very, very important. And I am, and my Liberal Democrats colleagues are absolutely behind any government proposals to ban this abhorrent practice, and we work together with all parties across Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you for that commitment, Vera. And you've raised this issue then, which we must come back to. And also there's a question which I want to put to Rowan in a moment, that's been raised about the subject of exorcisms and how the legislation should deal with that. But I thought the best way to comment on this, I know we're short of time, but we've got just over 10 minutes. I'd like to ask Jonathan to play us a short video of testimony from someone who has undergone conversion therapy in a religious setting. Alex sent us this testimony, which I think it's a privilege for us to hear, and to ask Rowan and Dr. Iggy Moon to then come back to this question when we've listened to the video. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Alex. I apologise for not being able to make the meeting, but I do appreciate being given the space to share my experience. I'm a trans man and I'm a counsellor in a final year of training. And I do have some personal experience of conversion therapy, although I would say that it wasn't really obvious to me what had happened until after the experience. So it was about 10 years ago, and it was before I began medically transitioning. At the time, I was only out as trans to my parents, but I was attending a church with my mum and my siblings, where I'd got talking with a pastor, and basically I was quite desperate for therapy. I was on a waiting list that seemed very long. I couldn't afford it privately. So the church, well, the pastor arranged for me to have therapy for free. And it turned out to be with a counsellor who they knew personally and who attended the church. So the pastor funded it. I told him about how I felt, and I said, this is how I felt since I was very young. But I'd had a lot of difficulty because I'd never felt accepted in terms of my faith or my religion. I was raised Christian, and there'd often been a sense of rejection from the church and from God, really. And in talking about all this, the pastor reiterated that that God had a a design and a plan, and that if I were to transition, I would go to hell, and that it was an abomination, and that, you know, being attracted to women was sinful, and the relationships were only, and marriage was only reserved for a man and woman, or i.e. a cis man and cis woman. And these are all things I'd heard before, but I just wanted to talk to someone. But the pastor had required me to sign the documents which would allow him to have access to the session, the material of the sessions between me and the counsellor. Looking back on it, I think I was quite naive and maybe too desperate to stand up for myself. And so I went ahead with it, and I went to therapy, and in therapy, first the counsellor seemed quite nice. I thought it was just nice to be able to talk about it. But then when I was talking about some of the discomfort I had with my body, and saying how I had really wanted to be able to have top surgery so I could become more comfortable with my chest, she told me outright that I shouldn't have surgery and to leave my chest alone and to not adapt my body. And I think at that point I started feeling like I couldn't really be as open with her as I thought I could. And I went back to the pastor and spoke to him, and he basically said that if I was looking for acceptance, I wouldn't get it there. And I think maybe at that point, I started to feel that, okay, I think there's an agenda here to try and get me to, you know, be okay with the body I was in and to adapt my sexuality, which I really believed wasn't going to happen. And I did try and talk about these things, and there was a lot of talk around me embracing the lie, and that's why I felt comfortable with my identity. And the reason that what I was hearing was hurtful to me was because it was about a fight, and I was basically fighting with the devil or whatever had kind of possessed me to be trans, and he didn't really believe that it was a thing. So it was a really painful experience for me, and I feel that if it wasn't for more my mum at the time, I'm not sure how I would have dealt with an experience like that. You know, as a trans person, to be told to strip naked in front of a mirror and thank God for my female body was quite damaging. And I'm just grateful that I had support outside of that. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to step away. And when I did step away, I decided to go ahead and medically transition. And I'm glad that I did, because for me, that was life-saving. I think that's something that's said often, but it is the case for a lot of people, and it was definitely the case for me. And I'm more content in my body now than I ever have been. But I will say that there is still a lot of scarring, not just from this church, but I suppose from that same kind of ideas that I've had to battle throughout life, where I think there's a specific idea about how we're supposed to be, how people are supposed to be. And when you don't meet those requirements or meet those standards, then this push to kind of adapt a person to meet societal conventions of what's normal. Yeah, I'm just grateful that I was able to come out of that. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Alex for that. Rowan, Alex's testimony speaks to the problem that you were talking about, and the questions that have been raised then about exorcism and practices of this kind, how we try to address these.
I think as I hinted, we need some broader view of what constitutes religious abuse. And certainly some practices of exorcism, as I've seen them operate in certain contexts, are unequivocally abusive and really, really disturbing. But I think what underlies this is a culture, a religious culture in which the idea that you might actually stand alongside somebody and offer them the range of choices to which they're entitled, that's not getting through. And what I'm interested in is how both legislative and cultural pressure can move to make that a sort of default position. That when you are presented with the kind of agonizing awareness that we've just heard spelled out, the awareness of rejection, how do you simply stand alongside someone and say, well, these are your choices, these are the channels that can be followed for your good, rather than, as we've seen, this what I called the manipulative or determined practice that has only one acceptable outcome. So yes, generally a clearer sense of what abusive behavior within religious communities looks like and what the redress is, more specifically how religious professionals are encouraged and pushed in the direction of standing alongside rather than standing over, you might say.
Thank you. Well, I think we need to sit down with you as well as other people to work out something about this sort of properly informed consent, because we obviously have a concept of informed consent in mental health. And I think there is a lot of mileage in what you're talking about there that we can work out. Thank you for that. Iggy, before I come back to Alicia just for a final comment, we've just got a couple of minutes. You've been at the forefront of this work in the MOU since the start. Perhaps you could just make your own observations on what we've been hearing today.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks to everybody who's attended. I mean, first of all, I want to really thank Alicia for all the work that she's done in putting together the wording for a ban and really helping us on the MOU to look at what we need to do in order to enable our voice to be heard by cross-party MPs and to give support where it's needed. I think it's been a fantastic job all round, actually. But I do need to say that within mental health, you know, there is work that we need to do, and we are willing to give that support to those who want the expertise that we have on the MOU from a range of organisations, from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Association of Christian Counsellors, etc., etc. And I say that because I am being bombarded at the moment by a group, and I thought it was interesting that Fiona, you brought this up as well, who online, who are now referring to themselves as a group of therapists who in the main, and clinicians who are qualified. So I need to make us aware that there are qualified clinicians, including psychologists and psychotherapists and endocrinologists, etc., who are against the idea of affirmation, of supporting people's gender identity, not of suggesting that these people are really lesbian and gay. And this group are not just growing in number, but are growing in having a strength of voice that is now beginning to attack organisations. And we need, I think, to be aware of organisations on the MOU have done as much, as Norman said, we need now to legislate so that the organisations on the MOU have the strength to move forward, and our organisations feel safe in being able to say that what Alicia Kearns is out to achieve will be part of our overall strategy in terms of bringing an end and banning conversion therapy. The beauty of today and of all these meetings is exactly like the coalition. We're all on board. We are all saying what we want. Now we need to work together to finally achieve it. I think we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Iggy. So finally, Alicia, I think we've all said that we support what you're doing. All our hopes rest on you.
No, we got here together and we will get to a band together. And it is the work of every single person on this call who's spoken today, and all those who have been so brave in sharing their stories, like Alex, like Matthew Hyman, who's on the call. And really, that is why we are doing this, because we are privileged as MPs to be able to give a voice to those who others seek to silence. And that is what we are doing on this. We are protecting people from those who seek to abuse their positions of trust, or those who don't know better and think they're doing what is right for their child, or somehow think that in some misguided way they are trying to create a better world for them. We know the dangers, we know the harms, we know why this has to be ended, we know it can be ended, and that is the most important point. All of us on here, whether it was Lord Dr. Rowan Williams or whether it was Hannah, talked through the different ways in which we can pragmatically deal with this. You know, Fiona and Trudy talked about from the mental health side. We can do this, we must do this, and there is the commitment, and there is opposition, and my inbox is full of it, and I have had some delightful emails over the last year, but change is never easy, but it is the right thing. And I just say thank you to all the MPs who've come on the call today and the members of the House of Lords who've come on. We can do this. We just need to make sure we stand strong and we do something that is pragmatic and sensible and protects who it needs to protect and doesn't in any way compromise those who are doing their job. We can do this, but it will be a result of all of our work and doing it all together. So thank you to everyone for everything they've been doing.
Thank you, Alicia. So we need to finish. It just remains for me then to once again thank the Royal College of Psychiatrists for hosting this webinar, to thank you to all our speakers for joining us, and as well those people who've attended throughout with your questions and your input. And I look forward to working with everybody in pressing forward with this from here on. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.